We're going to start in Proverbs 4 this morning. It's one of our initiatives to do some Life Together sermons a couple times a year. This will be one of those times. Proverbs chapter 4. I'll try not to look at the sea of purple out there, and I'll just pray for you as I speak. Just kind of thinking about Wade's family. He's got a lot of Viking fans. If you want to bring some excitement into your life, I know it's boring to lose all the time, but if you guys want to get on board with the winner, Green Bay is waiting for you, all right? Just throw that one out there. No comments from the peanut gallery, please. Pray for both teams. This is good. Proverbs chapter 4, also at a really, really sweet wedding here the other night. Matt and Becca got married. Becca Entz, of course, you guys know. So if you remember to pray for Matt and Becca as they start their marriage together. I heard it was just a really, really sweet service, and everything went really well. So it's always good to see our families, believers, coming together in marriage, strong believers, and just a great time for our church community too to support them in that. Whenever you think of crime scene investigation, real quick, I've got one book reference before we start. This is, actually, I've probably made this reference to you before. This is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book called Life Together. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer lived during Nazi Germany, of course, in Germany during this period. He was actually a martyr for the faith also and for challenging Hitler and his views and his dictatorship over Germany. He wrote this book. Actually, it's designed for seminarians. When the Fuhrer took over the church in Germany, they had to take the seminary underground, and pastors had to meet in secret locations to be trained up to be pastors and strong ministers of the Word of God. Life Together is the pastor's manual for that. This is a great little book. This is why we call our small group ministry Life Together Ministry. It comes exactly from this book. I recommend it to you. Bonhoeffer is known for Cost of Discipleship and a couple other works that he has done. In my opinion, it's just my opinion, this one is his best. It's short. You probably find it on Amazon for less than $10, and or recommend it to you. So after the service, if you want to come up and take a look at that, page through that book, you can. And if you need a copy even, our church would love to provide you a copy, provide that for you. So whenever you think of crime scene investigation, Sherlock Holmes is a name that's going to come to mind. Sherlock Holmes was one of the best detectives ever. He had a way of seeing things that other detectives could not see, of solving things that other detectives could not solve. He could go into a crime scene, into an area, and see details that nobody else was even looking for. And he had a couple famous lines that come across in some of the books. I want to read a few of them for you. Sherlock Holmes would say, "It is my business to know what other people don't know." A great line for a detective. I can know and understand and seek things out that other people aren't seeking, aren't even looking for. One of the awesome quotes that he has a lot to do with Bible study, even. He says this: "You see, but you do not observe. The distinction is clear between those things." He also would say there's nothing like firsthand evidence. Sherlock had to go get firsthand evidence from himself. He would not allow somebody else to tell him the facts. He went and he figured out the facts for himself. Howard Hendricks was probably one of the best professors at DTS. He taught Bible Study Methods 101, and he would say this: he applies Sherlock Holmes' detective work to studying Scripture, looking at the details of Scripture to understand what's going on. He said the only difference between a good Bible student and a great Bible student is that the great students know what to look for. They know what to look for. We're going to take a break, of course, from Galatians just this week and highlight our Life Together ministry. And one of the goals of our Life Together ministry, of course, is to look at ministry differently. This is a different look at ministry than what we typically associate with church ministry, even a Sunday school type ministry. Nothing wrong with those ways of doing ministry. But Life Together is a different look at it. And also, one of the purposes is a different way to listen as a group. And so this morning, one of the things that Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about in Life Together is he talks about 6 aspects of ministry. And one of the main goals of any minister is the ministry of listening. In small group ministry, in Life Together ministry, an aspect of doing this that distinguishes it from every other ministry we do is the ministry of listening. Listening to your friends. Listening to the person who's sitting across the room for you as they confess their sin, as they ask for accountability, as they share truth from Scripture, and growing together in community, really through an art of listening. And we've really lost this in our culture. Listening is not something that we value very much anymore. Bonhoeffer actually addresses this in his book. Here's what he says. He wrote, "The first service that one owes to others in the fellowship consists in listening to them. Just as love of God begins with listening to His Word, so the beginning of love for the brethren is learning to listen to them. It is God's love for us that He not only gives us His Word, but He also lends us His ear. And so it is His work that we do for our brother when we learn to listen to them. Christians, especially ministers, Bonhoeffer says, so often think that they must contribute something when they are in the company of others, that this is the one service that they have to render. And they forget that listening can actually be a greater service than speaking." So we're going to look at Proverbs this morning. This is going to be different than what we normally do on a Sunday. There's going to be a lot of jumping back and forth to different Proverbs as we go. But there are 3 things that stand out about the art of listening, or the ministry of listening, that we can grow in and embrace in all of our ministries. And the 3 things I have for you are in the slide behind you. This is our outline that we're going to work through this morning. Number 1, wise listeners refuse assumptions and regard inclinations. When we listen to other people in wisdom, we don't make assumptions right away. We make inclinations. And you're going to see this in Proverbs very clearly. Number 2, we are careful in concluding, and we are swift in discerning. Number 3, this morning on the ministry of listening, we are never landing, but we are always arriving. And Bonhoeffer also says this. He says, many people are looking for an ear that will listen. This is very true of our culture. The question for your kids, understanding the world and how to make decisions in this world, isn't a question of if they will listen. It's a question of who they're going to listen to. And most people in our culture are looking for that ear that's ultimately going to listen and to validate them. Many people are looking for an ear that will listen. They do not find it among Christians because they are talking when they should be listening. And here's the warning that he gives. He who can no longer listen to his brother will soon be no longer listening to God either. This is the beginning of the death of the spiritual life. And in the end, there is nothing left but spiritual chatter and clerical condensation arrayed in pious words. That's a strong, strong warning for all of us that we need to be considerate of. Before we jump into Proverbs, I just want to talk about a few things about this book. This is, Jim, you guys said you're going through Proverbs on Tuesday mornings now in chapter 9. Proverbs it's difficult to read this book. It's actually a good book. There's 31 chapters in Proverbs. If you read just a proverb a day, a chapter a day, you'll go through the whole book in a month. It's a great way to read the book of Proverbs. The structure of the book is a little tougher. What we said before when we did our study on Proverbs is that chapters 1 through 9 of Proverbs have a very distinct, a very tight structure. Chapters 1 through 9 are 10 lectures from a father to a son. And each of those lectures builds on the previous one. He's putting together a picture for a young man of what wisdom looks like as you walk in the world that we have. From chapter 10 into the end of the book, chapter 31, it's much more sporadic. There's still some structures as far as topical items that are addressed in Proverbs, but it's a little bit more of a hodgepodge. And as Westerners, we have a really difficult understanding of this. We can't understand how we can just have a proverb here and a proverb there. It seems too haphazard. superfluous for us to understand. But let me illustrate this with an example of how Proverbs is working. Listen to this. Proverbs 26, verse 4. Don't turn there. Stay in Proverbs 4. Proverbs 26, verse 4. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. The very next verse. Proverbs 26, verse 5. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. All right, so which one is it? You answer a fool according to his folly? Or do you not answer a fool according to his folly? The answer is yes. There's a time to answer a fool according to his folly, and there's a time not to do that. The Proverbs don't always apply to every single situation. It takes wisdom to know what situation calls for what proverb. Tom Constable's got an excellent commentary for free online if you go to soniclight.com through every book of the Bible. It's absolutely free, and here's what he says. He says, Proverbs are not always true, but they are usually true. What he means by that is for every distinct situation, Proverbs are not always true, but they are usually true. They represent life accurately, but not completely. And so the Proverbs are situational. It depends on the situation that determines which proverb can be used for that situation. You need to use wisdom in the application of those proverbs. Second, the book of Proverbs is wisdom literature. Job, Ecclesiastes, there's wisdom psalms in the Old Testament. This is what we would consider the genre of wisdom literature in the Old Testament. And wisdom literature is anchored specifically in fearing the Lord, not man, and encouraging us to trust God more than we trust in anyone or anything else. Okay, and that means this. The Proverbs are more than just moral principles. And here's how you know that. Job and Daniel were extremely moral men. They didn't have blessing and financial success in life. Just because they were moral didn't allow them the timeless principle that this is what God was going to do. The Proverbs are more than, they're deeper than just moral principles. You see moral people that go through difficulties all the time. You see immoral people that have great success and wealth all the time. And so you can't just have a one-to-one correlation and say these Proverbs are just timeless moral principles. It's not ultimately true. You have to go deeper, and you have to understand that all of the Proverbs, as wisdom literature, are asking us ultimately to stop depending on ourselves and start depending on God for everything, for wisdom, especially in life. Number one in your outline, and number one this morning. All right, we're going to look at these three Proverbs for this one point. The verse references are on the screen behind me. Look down at Proverbs chapter 4, verse 20. Wise people, in their listening, they refuse to make assumptions, and they have a regard to make inclinations. All right, chapter 4, verse 20. Solomon is writing here, and he says, My son, be attentive to my words, and incline your ear to my sayings. Let them not escape from your sight. Keep them within your heart. Verse 23, keep your heart with all diligence. From it flow the well springs of life. Now, we're going to focus on verse 20, but if you read verse 20 all the way down through the end of the chapter, verse 27, what you would notice is a lot of body parts that are mentioned. Verse 20, incline your ear. Verse 21, let them not escape from your sight. You're talking about your eyes. Verse 22, or verse 21 at the end there, keep them within your heart. Verse 24, put away from you crooked speech. That's your mouth that's being referred to there. Verse 25, let your eyes look directly forward. Verse 26, ponder the path of your feet. Proverbs 24, 20 through 27 is the anatomy of wisdom. And the first thing it talks about in the anatomy of wisdom, of human personification of wisdom, is your ear. All right, and biblical scholars refer to this as a literary device called synecdoche. And a synecdoche is a part that represents the whole. A biblical writer is using one thing to represent an entire thing, a part that represents the whole. The ear, one part, represents the rest of the body. If your ear is inclined to listen, the body follows with wisdom. This is the way to wisdom. A person who is listening, of course, is not assuming because they are inclining their ears. The strongest verb in verse 20 is that word, that inclination. Incline your ear. And that verb in Hebrew means this. It means to stretch out your ear or to bend your ear. That verb is used of the slopes of a riverbed. It is used of the shoulders of a donkey that bend over, or pouring a pitcher of water. When you incline your ear to someone or to something, literally, you stretch out, you bend it to listen extremely carefully, to pay close attention to what's being said. The principle behind Proverbs 4, verse 20, is that the path to a wise heart begins with an open ear. The path to a wise heart ultimately begins with an open ear. Flip over to Proverbs 8, verse 34. Proverbs 8, verse 34, "Blessed is the one who listens to me, watching daily at my gates and waiting beside my doors." Not too long ago, the Marvel movie series Avengers released one called Doctor Strange. Any of you guys watched Doctor Strange? Caught this? It's been out for a couple of years now. Doctor Strange is a really interesting story in the Marvel sagas. Doctor Strange is a brilliant surgeon. He's a world-renowned doctor. He can do things operating on people that other people just can't do. One day, of course, he goes out after he's done working, and he gets in his real fancy sports car, drives real fast, hits some rain, flies off a precipice, wrecks his car, has this horrible accident. And so they rush him to the hospital. After everything is said and done, he survived the car accident, but his hands are not what they used to be. They've been totally dismantled, totally destroyed, totally weakened by the accident. He can't use them anymore. So Dr. Strange does what a lot of us would do. He tries to find the best surgeons, the best doctors he can to strengthen his hands and get him back to the place he once was as this great, famous surgical doctor. And he spends just countless time and money doing that. Nobody can figure out the problem. Nobody can bring his hands back to strength where they used to be. And so he's about to give up. And then he hears about somebody called the Ancient One who lives in Nepal, India. And he makes it his life quest to go find the Ancient One who is going to be able to restore his hands like no medical doctor could ever restore his hands. So he goes to this place in Nepal, India. He figures out Nepal is not in India. Nepal is its own country. Just in case you were wondering, I'm saying this just north of India, excuse me. Goes to Nepal. He finds the Ancient One. He goes in, and the people realize there that all he wants to do is bring strength to his hands. He's extremely prideful. The way that he comes in and asks these people to help him is totally inappropriate. And so the first thing that they do is they kick him out and say, we can't help you here. You're way too prideful for this to have any influence on your heart and any influence on your life. And so what he does after he gets kicked out is this. He sits on the stoop of the door to that house, and he waits. He waits for somebody to open that door, to give him another chance to come in. This is his last hope. So he sits at the door, and he ultimately waits. Verse 34, look at this real quick. He says, "Blessed is the one who listens to me." Now, the me there is wisdom. Wisdom is personified as a person. It's actually woman wisdom. And woman wisdom is crying out. Skip back to verse 4 of chapter 8. Woman wisdom says this. She says, "To you, O men, I call, and my cry is to the children of men." Look at verse 6. "Hear," woman wisdom says, "for I will speak noble things, and from my lips will come what is ultimately right. Believers are called to listen to wisdom, to woman wisdom here in Proverbs 8. But even more than listening, there's something deeper going on in verse 34. Verse 34 says we should always be doing two things in chapter 8. Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates and waiting beside my doors. Those two things, exactly what Dr. Strange was doing, watching and waiting. If you want to pursue wisdom, if you want to know what wisdom sounds like, and make wise choices and be a wise person, you have to do these two things. They are in the present tense. You are always waiting and you are always watching, ultimately, for wisdom. But there's a time indicator in Hebrew. It's repeated. In our English translations, it doesn't really pick this up. Verse 34, literally, waiting at my gates daily. Daily watching besides my door. Daily, the Hebrew word there is yom, and it is repeated twice, right next to each other. Daily, daily. In other words, there is never a time when you don't listen for wisdom. There's never a time when you don't wait for wisdom. Pursuit of wisdom is not just listening sometimes. The pursuit of wisdom is listening all the time. And it's not just a lecture when we hear wisdom. It's actually a lifestyle that we live as we seek wisdom. Allow me to go just a step deeper in Proverbs 8, okay? Proverbs consists of two women. Two women are compared and contrasted throughout the book of Proverbs. One is the seductress, the adulterous woman. The other woman is woman wisdom. That's who's described in Proverbs chapter 8. And these two women act very differently from one another throughout the book. The adulterous woman, she goes out into the streets. She seeks a young man, a naive, a simple-minded man, to coerce and to seduce and to bring back into her home. Woman wisdom doesn't act that way at all in the book of Proverbs. Woman wisdom stays in the same place all the time. She stays in her home. And if you want to find woman wisdom at any point in time in your life, all you have to do is go to her door and seek out and wait for woman wisdom. And listen to her words when she appears. Bruce Waltke, in his excellent commentary on Proverbs, says this. He says, a son must exercise great care not to miss the unique opportunity to gain admission to wisdom, because many actually will miss that. How do you guarantee that you won't miss wisdom when she is crying out? You wait for her. You watch for her all the time. You incline your ear to listen for wisdom. Proverbs 22, last one before we move on in our outline here. Proverbs 22, verse 17. Skip there quickly. Proverbs 22, verse 17. I'm going to read down through verse 19. Verse 17 says, incline your ear, there's your verb again, stretch your ear out, bend your ear, and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge, to wisdom's knowledge. For it will be pleasant if you keep them within you, if all of them are ready on your lips, that you may that your trust may be in the Lord. I have made them known to you today, even to you. The principle here, of course, is the purpose of wisdom. What is the purpose of inclining your ear to wisdom? What is the result that we're ultimately looking for? So that your trust may be in the Lord. As you seek wisdom, as you find wisdom, as you listen and hear for wisdom, that will enable you to trust God even more. The principle is this: the better you are at listening, the stronger you become at trusting. Or, put it this way, actively trusting God comes through passionately listening for truth. Actively trusting God comes through passionately listening for truth and ultimately for wisdom. As you pursue wisdom, as you listen for wisdom, as you wait and you watch at the gates of wisdom, you refuse to assume what might be true, and you regard to listen for what actually is true. That is the pursuit of wisdom. Number 2, in your outline, number 2 this morning. Wise people are careful in concluding and swift in discerning. Wise people, as they listen in life, are careful in concluding, and they are swift in discerning. Our English word discern, if you do a study of Proverbs, a word study, and you search for any time discernment, discerning is used, you're gonna have about 30 references to discernment in Proverbs. Discernment is a really key theme throughout the book of Proverbs. You see it right at the beginning. Okay, the purpose of the book of Proverbs is the first few verses in chapter 1. Don't flip back there, just listen to this. The purpose of Proverbs is to know wisdom and instruction, to understand. That Hebrew word understand is the word discern, translated discernment in our English versions. We cannot gain God's wisdom unless we are able to discern it from the world's wisdom. Does that make sense? You cannot gain wisdom. I cannot gain wisdom unless there's a process of discerning the world's wisdom from God's wisdom. What seems like wisdom to the world, the Apostle Paul says, is foolishness to God. What seems like foolishness to the world is wisdom to God. To discern something in Proverbs is to use your senses that God has given you, your eyes, your ears, your taste, your mouth, all of these things, your touch even, is to use your senses to gain understanding, to gain discernment. Now, here's the really hard part about this as you live life. It is very possible to hear something and not understand it. It is very possible to see things and not perceive them, right? This is why Jesus speaks to people in parables. It all goes back to Isaiah chapter 6 and his ministry. And we read something like this: "Go and say to this rebellious people," listen to this, "keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make their hearts dull, their ears heavy, and their eyes ultimately blind." Just because you hear something doesn't necessarily make that wisdom. Just because you see something doesn't mean that it's right or it's wrong. You have to use discernment to judge those things with godly wisdom. Discernment must be accompanied by wisdom from God and by the fear of the Lord, those two things. Otherwise, you cannot discern it as godly wisdom. Otherwise, a person is operating by wisdom from below rather than wisdom from above. These are the two things compared and contrasted in James chapter 3. All right? Just because, listen carefully, just because counsel sounds smart, looks good, and feels right, doesn't mean that it is right. As a person gaining wisdom from the book of Proverbs, you have to listen, you have to see things, and then you have to discern them. Discern them. And it's very difficult to do that, but it's what we are called to do as we pursue wisdom. Here's just my very short, limited experience with this, somebody in my life. I hope that everybody has 2 to 3 people in their life who they consistently go to for wisdom. Right? This is part of our Life Together ministry. We want these relationships where you can have close intimacy with other people and actually look to people for wisdom as they are walking with God. So I hope you have that. In my life, one of those guys is a guy that you hear me mention all the time. His name is Butch Simmons. Just a little bit over 70. Met him in Starkville, Mississippi. You got to say it real fast. And you take one of the S's out of there, the 2 S components. Mississippi. It's not Mississippi. Mississippi is how you say that, just in case you were wondering. You have to discern that as wisdom. Butch Simmons is one of those guys in my life that I have for discernment and to gain godly wisdom. I call him once every other week at least. And the conversation will go something like this: Butch, I need about 10 minutes of your time. I got to describe the situation that's going on, and I need your wisdom. And so what will happen is I'll I'll start talking about the situation. Every once in a while, about 5-10 minutes go on. Every once in a while, Butch will interject with a question on something that I said, but for the most part, he's just listening. All he is on the other side of the phone, just listening to what I'm saying. And then he does something incredible. And this is how, one of the ways that I try to discern godly wisdom from worldly wisdom. This is one of the ways I'm convinced that Butch Simmons is giving me godly wisdom. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, after I describe the situation that I need wisdom for, here's what he does. All he does is he starts asking me more questions. Okay? What about this situation? Tell me more about this person. What do you mean when you said this? What did you have in mind? What did you think was the right thing to do in this situation? How did you react to that situation to begin with? All he does is consistently ask these questions. And the principle, what he's trying to do is he's trying to listen in order to discern. He's asking questions so that he can discern the situation. Okay? Look at Proverbs chapter 10, verse 13. And I hope you have somebody in your life that does that with you as well. Proverbs 10, verse 13 says this. On the lips of him who has understanding, discernment there, wisdom is found. Proverbs 10:13. But a rod is for the back of him who lacks sense. Now, two people are compared in that verse. The wise and the one who lacks sense. Two body parts are compared in that verse. The lips, the mouth of the wise, and the back of the person who lacks sense. How do you know, if you're going to a person, that they're giving you sound biblical wisdom? How do you begin to discern those things? There's two indicators, according to this verse. Indicator one is, how does this person talk? What are they saying to you? Are they asking good questions? Are they seeking discernment for themselves? You can discern a lot just from the way that people are responding to your questions and to your situations. And so the first indicator you look for, are they asking questions? Are they seeking discernment in this? The second indicator you look at is you look at their life. If you're pursuing somebody who's going to give you good, godly wisdom, godly counsel, their life should be one that has not suffered the back of discipline, but permeates the mouth of wisdom. Does that make sense? If a person's life is more displaying, it is more manifesting of discipline rather than a mouth that issues forth wisdom, that might not be a person who you should go to for discernment. You have to discern these things and gain wisdom for yourself. Flip over to chapter 14, Proverbs. I hope this is, you guys are tracking here. We will wrap this up, of course, with our Life Together ministry and talk about this ministry of listening. Proverbs 14, verse 15. The simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. Prudence is how the ESV translates that word there, that verse. The Hebrew is actually the word for understanding or for discernment. Okay, you've heard this famous quote before: "Only fools rush in." Right? In discernments and seeking wisdom from people, only fools rush in. There's always two sides to a story. There's always more to understand about any situation. This verse has more than just two people that are compared, the fool and the naive. It also has two ways of life that are compared. There's two walks that are compared. The gullible automatically believes what is said. The discerning person is careful with every step that they take. And I love how Proverbs describes that. Discerning wisdom is a process. It's a walk. You do this one step at a time, and you do it very carefully. So be careful when you're seeking wisdom for a situation or anything like that. Be careful in concluding. Ultimately, be swift in discerning. Those things is extremely important. Number 3, in your outline, number 3 this morning. Wise men are never landing but always arriving. They're never landing but always arriving. In the 1600s, Spain was one of the world's greatest powers. And they amassed a great amount of wealth. Spain became a very successful country and made an identity for themselves by seeking out the gold and silver mines in Mexico and Peru. And so what they would often do is they would send out their explorers to go into the land and to go into these mines and to excavate all the gold and silver that they could find. And they loaded up fleets of ships. And they would come back after their excavations and after their time of discovery. They would load up their ships with all the treasure that they found, and they'd bring it back to Spain. On September 4th, 1622, 27 ships sailed out from Havana, Cuba, back to Spain with treasure for King Philip IV. All right, so if you guys need your Western European history, King Philip IV is a key name. Connor, memorize that guy. He's a very important figure. They loaded up 27 ships, and there was one ship in particular called the Atoka. And what you need to know, Ken Stringer could tell you, Norma could tell you this right now. September 4th, good time to sail across the Atlantic Ocean or bad time to sail? This is what we commonly refer to as what season? Hurricane season. It wasn't long before they hit a hurricane in the middle of the Atlantic. 6 ships completely destroyed. Barely, many of them still not found. 2 of them laid on the surface of the Pacific Ocean near the Florida Keys until the 1900s. A man came along. He was a World War II veteran by the name of Mel Fisher. Some of you guys probably heard of Mel Fisher. Mel Fisher sold everything that he had in order to excavate, to search at the bottom of the ocean floor for treasure, for shipwrecks, and for things like the Atoka. It took him 3 years. At that time, this thing called scuba diving wasn't even heard of. It was a brand new concept that people were just getting into. Mel Fisher was excited about it. This is how he got into seeking out treasure at the bottom of the ocean floor. For 3 years, he searched for treasure for the Atoka. For 3 years, they finally realized that they were searching in the wrong spot. And they moved their camp, moved their search completely to a different place. For the next 17 years, he searched for treasure. Mel Fisher's one of his sons drowned in the ocean. He was diagnosed for cancer in that 17 years. He got sued by the United States government. Every time this guy would go to the ocean floor and bring up a gold bar or a silver coin or something, just real infrequent little treasures that he'd find on the ocean floor, every time something like that would happen, the government would come in and confiscate it and take it. And they'd bring charges against him and say, you're searching on our property. Of course, Mel Fisher, he ended up countersuing 150 cases that the government had falsely brought against him as he searched out for these treasures. Pretty interesting story. Of course, eventually, he came across the Atoka, and it became one of the most significant, valuable discoveries of any shipwreck at any time in our world. And the value of what he found on the ocean floor was over $400 million. At 40 tons of gold and silver that was found somewhere under the ocean. 114,000 Spanish silver coins, emeralds, and artifacts, all laying there because they couldn't figure out not to sail during hurricane season. By the way, if you need a good spot to go on your honeymoon, go to the Caribbean during hurricane season. It's about half the cost of what you'd normally pay. Me and Brandy got married at the end of August, and we went to Jamaica. I'm like, there's no way we're ever going to afford to go to Jamaica. We found out it was pretty cheap, and I had no idea why. Well, we flew over a hurricane on the way back to the States, so we quickly discovered there's not really a whole lot of people that go to the Caribbean during hurricane season. So that was what I was asking you if you guys were going. Look at Proverbs chapter 2, okay? Proverbs chapter 2, verse 1. This is one of my favorite sections of Proverbs. I've actually probably read this to you before. Proverbs 2, verse 1. My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments within you, making your ear attentive to wisdom. Again, inclining your ear, inclining your heart to understanding. Verse 3. Yes, if you call out for insight, if you raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver, if you search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord. Then you will find the knowledge of God. All these verses are anchored in what we would call conditional clauses. All right, so look back at verse 1. My son, if you receive, if you treasure my commandments. Verse 3, yes, if you call out for insight. Verse 4, if you seek it like silver, then you will find the knowledge of the Lord. Here's the truth. Some people will seek wisdom. Some people won't. Wisdom only comes to those who seek it. But just because you seek it doesn't necessarily mean that you will ultimately find it. How can we strengthen? How can we be more convinced that we will find wisdom when we seek it? Turn to chapter 8 again and look at verse 17. Chapter 8, verse 17. Again, this is the personification of wisdom in chapter 8. Woman wisdom says this: I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently find me. This proverb goes one step further in seeking wisdom. And what stands out the most in seeking wisdom is simply this. If you are going to seek wisdom, it will look a lot like seeking a love relationship. Seeking wisdom looks a lot like seeking a relationship. And you will never understand seeking wisdom if you do not understand Proverbs 8, verse 17. The person who seeks wisdom for the sake of wisdom will never gain it. But the person who seeks God for the sake of finding God will always find it. The person who seeks wisdom for the sake of gaining wisdom will never gain it. But the person who seeks God for the sake of gaining God will never ultimately lose it. Augustine put it this way: our problem is not that our loves are too strong. Our problem is that our loves are too weak. If you truly desire to seek wisdom, if you want to grow in wisdom, don't seek wisdom for the sake of gaining wisdom. Seek Christ for the sake of gaining Christ, and you will find wisdom thrown in. Don't seek wisdom for the sake of gaining wisdom. Seek Christ for the sake of gaining Christ, and you will find wisdom thrown in. Number 1, refuse making assumptions, but have a regard for making inclinations. Number 2, be careful in concluding, be swift in discerning. Number 3, wise men are never landing. They are always arriving. They are always seeking. And it's not just wisdom that they're seeking, it's God that they're seeking. How do we apply this to our small group with Life Together Ministry? I want you to listen again to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He says this: brotherly pastoral care is essentially distinguished from preaching. Understand that our Life Together Ministry, these small groups, even a Sunday school group, it's different than coming and listening to a sermon. It's a different aspect of community and fellowship and discipleship in the body of Christ. So Bonhoeffer says, brotherly pastoral care is essentially distinguished from preaching by the fact that, added to the task of speaking the word, there is the obligation of listening. He says there's a kind of listening with half an ear that presumes already to know what the other person has to say. It is an impatient, inattentive listening that despises the brother and is only waiting for a chance to speak. All of us have met these people, right? They're not really listening to you. They're just waiting for a chance to speak something to you. My brother's one of them. I love him to death. He's 2 years older. He's got that older brother syndrome kind of thing, and he's never listening to me. He's just waiting to talk to me. I should say never, usually. He's just waiting to talk. He rarely listens. All of us know these people. It's a key ministry in life in discipleship, in the body of Christ, to know that people are listening to you. And not necessarily inclined to speak every time, but every time inclined to listen. Bonhoeffer says it's little wonder that we are no longer capable of the greatest service of listening that God has committed to us, and that is the service of hearing our brother's confession. So he says we should listen with the ears of God in order that we might speak the words of God. Make sense? We listen with the ears of God so that we can speak the words of God, discerning any given situation. I read an article from Psychology Today. As a young pastor standing up here reading articles from Psychology Today, you have to wonder a little bit about what's going on upstairs, okay? And in this article, it's actually a really great article. It says this. There's a little poem that the writer starts with. It goes something like this. A wise old owl lived in an oak. The more he saw, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he heard. Why can't we all be like that wise old bird? Right. The article gave 3 ways to be a better listener, and I like it. I want to mention some of them. Number 1, to be a better listener in any ministry context, be respectful. Be respectful of the other person. All of us have an opportunity to listen and to validate people as we listen to them. It shows that we truly care about them. It shows that we truly value their perspective. Asking questions as we listen allows people to brainstorm ideas. It allows creativity to come to the table. Well, did you consider this? Did you consider doing this in response to that instead? How did that come across your mind to make that decision instead of that decision? It doesn't mean, when you listen, it doesn't mean you can't ask pointed questions. Just make sure you're asking questions. That's the bigger key. Number 2, this article says, talk less than you listen. You guys have heard the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle? 20% of the people do 80% of the work kind of thing. This article says, try to listen 80% of the time and speak 20% of the time. Right, Kennedy? Are you listening next to Jen there? She's not even listening. She's just talking to you right now. This article says, listen 80% of the time and actually talk 20% of the time. And that changes the dynamic of seeking wisdom. Number 3, it says, as you listen, challenge assumptions. Really great listeners have the ability to dig beneath the surface, to challenge the overriding assumptions that are driving people to think a certain way or even to act a certain way. There's always a way that things have always been done. That is usually the most comfortable way. And whenever you change that, you have to get below the surface and listen deeply. Why have you always lived your marriage that way? Why have you always pursued this avenue of your life and pursued this career? Get beneath the surface, diving into those things as you listen. And of course, ultimately, we want to say this. Look no further than the person and work of Jesus Christ. Right? In the Gospels, almost every single Gospel will say something like this. Jesus will say, I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but to do the will of the Father who has sent me. I don't do anything on my own initiative. I do the things that my Father has commanded me to do. Jesus' whole life and his whole posture, the most wise person that has ever lived and ever will live, the most wise God among any other false god is Jesus. And he designated his entire ministry to the ministry of listening. Listening for wisdom. Listening to the Father. Listening over and over again. In your small group ministries, leaders, you guys that are actively engaged in these tight relationships with small groups, here's what I want you to think about as you go from this Sunday. How are you listening to your brothers and sisters in Christ in that context? Are you listening 50% of the time and speaking 50% of the time? Everybody's going to go to their small group ministries or their Bible studies, and nobody's going to say a word now this week, right? I was just putting my 80% in. How much are you listening? How much are you valuing your brother and sister in Christ? How much are you asking questions so that you can shepherd their hearts and encourage them with godly wisdom? Are you a discerning influence in their life? Or are you a quick influence that's going to make assumptions and automatically just speak in every situation? This is an avenue that all of us, including my small group ministry and me, I'm up here the one doing all the talking about listening. This is one that I need to grow in as well. It's one that we all need to grow in. So I want to admonish you to do that this morning. I'm going to pray just a quick couple words here after I pray this morning. Father in heaven, we